So apparently the internet is freaking the fuck out about Barbie again, and this time because it's going up against Oppenheimer. The irony of that. So yeah, apparently the internet freaked out last week after the Oscar nominations got announced because of the perceived snubs of Margot Robbie not getting a nomination for Best Actress and Greta Gerwig not getting a nomination for Best Director for the movie Barbie. And discourse occurred, as it typically does. There was think pieces in newspapers and people discoursing all over social media and Twitter and things like that. And I wanted to talk about this specifically because I think a lot of the reactions to these perceived snubs reveals a lot about what I was trying to get to with my longer video essay that I did on my main channel about the white feminism of Barbie. I think if you look at how the discourse has gone around these snubs, or at least perceived snubs, it reveals how white feminism quite often uses the veneer of feminism to just kind of stoke these infighting conversations that don't really uplift anybody, but just generate these discourses that create and exacerbate fault lines of division, rather than moving forward conversations about how we become a more inclusive society and actually fight for, the rights of everyone and create an egalitarian world. I know that's a lot to put on this conversation about Oscar nominations, but I really do think that there's an interesting kernel of something that we can discuss surrounding white feminism here. Also, you may be wondering why I'm working down here, by the way, and that's because I am currently working on a very much not Lego version of a very much not Lord of the Rings Sauron's tower that I'm making, and I just figured my neurodivergent brain could do two things at once. We'll see. I've gotten this far so far, so we'll see how far I can get to that. So I think the place to start is just kind of to talk about my problems with the Barbie movie itself. I already did a whole video on it. Go check it out for my more nuanced thought. But my basic criticism of the movie was, while I did find that there were valuable parts of Barbie that I think were really meaningful statements that I hadn't really seen in a movie before, especially on a blockbuster scale, such as that moment where Barbie looks at an older woman and calls her beautiful, which I thought was a really beautiful moment of seeing aging in women, which is often very much devalued and seen as gross or seen as a loss of purity or femininity or beauty, was really, really sweet and wonderful. But despite that, overall, the main problem of the film to me was that while everyone was praising it as this feminist 101 movie that sort of got people into discussing feminism, I found that a lot of it was very pernicious in actually being very much white feminism 101, with the distinction in my mind being, when it comes to talking about feminism versus white feminism, is how it all filters the idea of discussing womanhood through this idea that white womanhood is the natural, normal, or sort of ubiquitous state of womanhood, that then all other versions of womanhood, be you trans, be you black, be you, any other sort of marginalized identity, sort of are variations upon from. That doesn't look at the very necessary understanding that has to come with when we talk about how women are commodified and devalued, how that does come out of this history of colonization and how white women were framed against black people and against black women specifically to constantly prop up a sort of white supremacist worldview. You could look at the suffragettes throughout history about how many white supremacist men would use white suffragettes to say, well, we need to uplift white women so that we can keep black people from getting the vote here in America. But that, it goes throughout all of history, all the way back to, the slave trade and, the European colonialist efforts to sort of see African people as uncivilized brutes versus the pure, austere womanhood of European societies. And Barbie, unfortunately, kind of perpetuates that by not only just filtering all conversations through this Margot Robbie lens of womanhood that it views as stereotypical womanhood, quite literally in the words of the film, but then tries to filter a trans experience, a black experience, a Latina experience, all through that sort of white womanhood lens without really articulating any of those other issues. And in fact, perpetuating a lot of them, such as the message that the movie ends on of, having a vagina is what signifies you being a woman, which very much can ostracize trans women, or the very weird anti-native strain throughout the film of the jokes against it's indigenous people who died from inoculation, or the Mount Rushmore visual gags in there, which was very offensive to many indigenous folks, considering that is a very sacred site for a lot of indigenous tribes. And it goes to the film not being like overtly bigoted, but what often happens with white feminism is that because it doesn't look at this more intersectional lens, it tends to just have this myopic view of womanhood. And then when people try to say, well, you could have a more holistic view of womanhood that actually uplifts women, a lot of these white feminists will sort of push back and say, well, we're just trying to talk about our experience and not understanding how you're upholding all these other bigotries by not looking at it in these intersectional ways. And then also not being able to articulate how to create and generate a society based on more egalitarian worldviews. Because Barbie itself just showcases like, oh, what if we had a matriarchal world that's just patriarchy inversed rather than, being something different, and not being able to even envision something different, to the point that the movie literally ends on this idea that men need to suffer the same amount that women have suffered within our, American society. And then once we have that, like, what I experienced sort of revenge feeling, then we can then work on creating something more egalitarian. But ultimately, all that does is reinforce this idea of like men needing to be versus women and not actually creating a more uplifting conversation. It's this constant idea of like things need to be placed in binaries, man versus woman or white women versus black women, instead of trying to articulate the different ways that these things intersect through racialization, class differences, gender and gender roles, and things like that, that ultimately just upholds the very lines of oppression and distinction that our hierarchical society bases itself upon, rather than breaking them down. And the reason that I think that that's important to articulate here is because we are seeing the exact same thing playing out in real life right here with this discourse on the Barbie movie. I want to take a quote that I saw from an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times that people were sharing around, where writer Mary McNamara discussed why Margot Robbie or Greta Gerwig were snubbed by the Oscars.
If only Barbie had done a little time as a sex worker, or barely survived becoming the next victim in a mass murder plot, or stood accused of shoving Ken out of the dream house's top window. Certainly, millions of Barbie fans are currently wishing they could push someone, perhaps a member or two of the Film Academy, out of a very high window.
This quote, tons of people rightly pointed out the way that white feminism often works. Because clearly the writer here is alluding to Lily Gladstone, who this year is the first Indigenous American woman to be nominated for an Oscar for her performance in Killers of the Flower Moon, which itself was about the Osage County murders, where a bunch of Indigenous women were killed by white dudes in order to gain their money. And you can see in Mary's article that she's framing this Indigenous woman as against Margot Robbie and Greta Gerwig's nomination, Margot Robbie specifically, and kind of putting down the importance of her nomination and her work and the story being told in that movie in order to then sort of like uplift the like propellant force and feminism of Barbie, without talking about like how important it was for those stories to be told to a larger audience that obviously did not know them, but also the historic nature of her nomination as an Indigenous woman. And it goes to how white feminism quite often will frame women, especially marginalized women, against more privileged women. You see this constantly with things like TERFs being very much an offshoot of white feminism, constantly framing like cis women as being in danger of trans women, or like this idea that women need to become girl bosses, like they need to become CEOs and capitalists and exploit everyone else without actually doing anything to actually break down like the capitalist system that very much also ostracizes women in numerous different ways, whether it be like charging women more for products or not allowing them to get the same wages or actually be able to be equal opportunity in hiring. So this just reveals that like very specific like white feminist viewpoint of like women just being at expense of other women. But then you will also see a lot of this discourse sort of turn around and flip it around and being like, oh, look at all these male nominees. I mean, it goes to like this famous Oscar moment.
To be here to present the award for Best Director.
And here are the all-male nominees. For The Shape of Water.
And that moment is so telling because that was also the year that like Guillermo del Toro was nominated for an Oscar, a Mexican man who very often don't get nominated. And his movie, The Shape of Water, I believe was that year, was itself about like, you know, women and queer folks and weird fish people being able to fight back against like oppressive systems of power. But he gets sort of just lumped in as like, oh, one of the male directors. Again, erasing that like intersectionality of his identity, but then also just ubiquitizing it as like men versus women without like really talking about the systems that kind of create that moment in the first place in numerous different ways. I mean, we could talk about like how there aren't many women directors hired at that level that get recognized by the Oscars quite often. Like there's a whole system underpinning that, or the fact that like women's stories are not seen as valuable because they don't fit into what is typically known as Oscar bait kind of films. Like the Academy very clearly has a desire for these very prestige-y, often period piece movies that tell the story of great men of history. I literally see that with Oppenheimer. And then all other types of stories are like whether they be science fiction stories or marginalized stories or whatever, are often not very valued by the Academy. And that comes often down to like the different perspectives that our culture don't view as valuable because they don't fit into like what storytelling should be. And there's like no discussion of that. There's just discussion of like, oh, women should be, especially white women, should be of equal parity of men within these situations, rather than talking about these larger systems that underpin this, that create this in the first place, and also set up this competitive mindset as well. And this is something that I don't really see a lot of people talking about, at least in this context with Barbie, is that like the whole idea of the Oscar is rather fucked up because it creates this competition mindset around art of like there can be only one best picture, when art is an incredibly subjective thing and speaks to many different ideas and concepts and emotions that we are all feeling. And so this idea of like putting them in competition with each other is ultimately just like removing the entire point of art. Like art should be in conversation with each other, not trying to say what is better than each other. But our culture generally just constantly likes to put things at odds and create these competitions that stack things against each other, rather than trying to ask us what conversations we could have across these stories. And that goes to like that white feminist mindset as well, that sort of builds upon this sort of colonialist idea of like, you know, it's this versus this, that versus that, rather than building itself up upon other conversations, which is so funny specifically with this being about Barbie, because one of the things we even saw this very year is how that conversation around art can be generated with the Barbenheimer phenomenon itself, about how people like literally didn't see Barbie and Oppenheimer open on the same day as like this thing where like, oh, they need to be in competition with each other for how much money they can get, but actually they are like two works of art that we can like weirdly put next to each other, see at the same time, and like have conversations, whether they be sort of like laughable and having fun with it, or actually like being like these interesting ways of like two ways women's stories are told. Like there was a much greater conversation putting those movies in connection with each other than there was in sort of putting them against each other, and actually more profit to be made too. And so it's just funny that now we're sort of seeing the opposite of that, of like, oh, you know, these male directors like Christopher Nolan are now in competition with Barbie and actually shoving out women, as well as, you know, these marginalized stories of like Indigenous women also shoving each other out. And also, speaking on Lily Gladstone's nomination for Killers of the Flower Moon, this is something I'm not going to end up critiquing, but it's more a question and something I've been thinking about, is that, you know, it is historic that Lily Gladstone is getting a nomination here as, you know, the first Indigenous American woman actress to get that nomination. But you can also look at Killers of the Flower Moon, which I do think is a really great movie, but you can also see it being very much a movie from the perspective of Martin Scorsese, a white dude who is ultimately kind of struggling in the film itself, very openly struggling in the film itself, with how do you tell this story of, you know, the Osage County murders when you yourself are not from an Indigenous person. The little end of the movie, if you haven't seen it, minor spoilers here, it's not a spoiler for the plot necessarily, but the movie ends with this framing device of like you having watched the whole movie, seen this story, and then it becomes a sort of radio drama that is very much sensationalizing the story that you just saw. And it ends with Martin Scorsese himself literally coming on camera and sort of delivering the final, more somber note that story ends on. And you can, and the way I interpret that is that Martin Scorsese is kind of like trying to figure out like, this tension that he sits within with being someone who wants to uplift this story, knows that it has been sensationalized throughout history and also erased throughout history for a more, for the sort of the dominant hegemonic culture. And him sort of like wrestling with that tension. In conversations that I've seen, I watched a lot of Indigenous folks talk about the film and seeing a lot of Indigenous folks have conflicting feelings about it, with the sense that there is like, this is a movie that's bringing this story front and center to many people who would not have known it. It's uplifting a lot of Indigenous actors into the limelight, Lily Gladstone sort of being one of the most prominent, but numerous others as well. And really like just bringing attention to the community and the story in a really important way. But at the same time, it is a story that is not being told for an Indigenous audience. It's made to be told for a much larger audience as well, and also still centers around a story of Indigenous pain and trauma and murder. Whereas you could look at something like Reservation Dogs, which is a fantastic show made by mostly Indigenous creators and artists, both in front of the camera and behind it, that I think from listening, this is not me saying this, but listening, like kind of more approaches in more Indigenous style of storytelling that, yes, touches upon the ways Indigenous people have been ostracized and otherized in our culture, but also has a much more community mindset, also uplifts the more specific conversations within that community, and also engages in certain types of Indigenous storytelling, not telling great man myths, but myths of community, stories that talk about connections across life and death and through generations. And so, you look at Reservation Dogs or The Killers of the Flower Moon, and you can see the two different audiences that are there, and you don't see, that type of story getting nominated for the Oscars. You do see the type of story of Killers of the Flower Moon. And that's not to devalue it, but to say that there is a certain lens being placed upon it. And so it kind of goes towards like how we put people like Lily Gladstone in this spotlight that like puts her in a spotlight outside of her community, and then we kind of frame her against like white women who then are sort of like trying to be in competition with men and this system that they only see themselves as this sort of like critical focal point through.
It's also worth mentioning here, though I don't have time to get really deep into this story, the tale of Maria Louise Cruz, also known as Shasheen Littlefeather, who was an Indigenous rights activist who gave a speech for Marlon Brando where he turned down his Academy Award in protest of Hollywood's portrayal of Indigenous Americans, for which he was intensely vilified by many members of the Academy.
And the reasons for this being are the treatment of American Indians today by the film industry.
However, it was later revealed that despite her activism, she actually had faked a lot of her ancestry as an Indigenous American and was actually of Spanish-Mexican descent with no ties to any tribal groups within what is now known as the United States. And while there are a lot of complicated things to discuss with that story, the main reason I bring it up right at this moment is to showcase that there has been a long history of Indigenous issues being discussed and often dismissed and derided at the Oscars and within Hollywood itself, making Lily Gladstone's nomination here even more complex and unique in what it means in terms of her being nominated in a system that ultimately has really harmed the Indigenous community with its portrayals of Indigenous folks and vilification of the Indigenous community, but also the fact that she is an Indigenous woman coming into this system that has done that. And so to be recognized by, the Oscars has a very conflicting feeling for many Indigenous folks that, again, I can't speak to, but certainly can at least say, go listen to Indigenous folks on that issue to just hear the conversations around what's happening with that. All this is ultimately going to say, though, here is that it is extremely diminutive to just point and say, oh, look, she was in an Oscar baity film by Martin Scorsese, and that's the reason she was nominated over Barbie, and I think deeply offensive to the complexity of that issue.
And it's why, again, Barbie was so insidious to me, because I think it is really necessary if you're going to talk about feminism and how to uplift women to really have those intersectional conversations, less this type of competition mindset continue to be perpetuated. So it's why I get really frustrated when I do see people say like, look, I think Barbie is ultimately fine because it was Feminism 101. I mean, I think even America Ferrera said that in a comment, being like, look, people are saying that Barbie wasn't that good because it didn't like go deeper. But really, I think it was like supposed to introduce people to feminism. And I think I agree. I would love a movie that did introduce people to feminism. My problem with Barbie is it introduces people to white feminism. And the pathway that Barbie takes you down, if you continue sort of following its line of thought, even if it is just the basic version of that, creates a much more insidious problem than, if we were talking about more holistic narratives around women and what womanhood means, especially in a very racialized and class-divided society. And then putting that in connection with queerness and transness as well, and how those are necessary conversations across those intersections too. I have not been working on this Lego thing at all. I got very wrapped up in this. I'm sorry. Speaking of that, there's two more things that I kind of want to talk about here. Is that one, Ryan Gosling and America Ferrera were both nominated for the movie, and people aren't really even talking about America Ferrera's nomination at all, which kind of speaks to like the devaluing of her as like a woman of color here as well, and how like no one's sort of mentioning as much her nomination. Yes, it is sort of brought up, but like she's just not even seen as worthy of conversation. Which is funny considering that like she gives that speech in the movie about like the conflicting places that women are placed into. Like that is while I have problems with that speech, that is like the thematic crux of the entire film. But we're still not really talking about her nomination as much.
You have to be a boss, but you can't be mean. You have to lead, but you can't squash other people's ideas. You're supposed to love being a mother, but don't talk about your kids all the damn time.
Though again, as I talked about in my main video on Barbie, it is interesting how she is positioned as a woman of color within the film, where we don't really see any cultural context around her character being discussed. She is sort of placed in like the managerial class to a degree, where she's like a secretary within the film, which is still like a devalued place that women are placed into, but often not a place that you'll see many Latina women being placed into in our society, being like the executive in like some high-end like CEO's office. And so it's like still positioning her in a place that like many white women would identify into her with. So like there's that conversation you can have as well. But then also the fact that Ryan Gosling was nominated too. And it speaks to like how a lot of people found value in the movie's empathy towards Ken, even more so than the film's discussion towards Barbie. And I do think that there's value to say like, yes, patriarchy harms us all, including men. I think that's a very valuable conversation and necessary conversation to have. But the way the film frames it, number one, is still like men need to suffer the same amount that women suffered, even if we're going to show them empathy, which I think kind of undermines its ultimate message. But also is like this movie about women, you're still nominating the dude within it. And I think that is not an Oscars problem fault. I think it's a part of the problem of the film. That the film makes Ken more interesting and takes more time to empathize with Ken than I think even Barbie at times. And even gives Ryan Gosling like the musical moment of the film. Like he has the musical song, which always like bothered me when I watched the movie, because it's like, you didn't give the big musical number to the woman in a Barbie movie? It's wild to me, and I think that is part of the film sort of like struggling with this, like, well, we need to have empathy for men, and we need to have this moment for men, which I think is important, but also like it's this constant like need to, we spend more time empathizing with those who are in the powerful position rather than empathizing with people who are more ostracized. So like while the movie will have empathy for women, have empathy for men, who do all suffer, but are what our society often tells us to have empathy for, and not the more marginalized women throughout the film. They're just seen as variations upon Barbie. And then the final thing that I do want to talk about here is the fact that like Margot Robbie and Greta Gerwig are nominated. Margot Robbie is nominated as a producer on the film for the Best Picture nomination, and Greta Gerwig is nominated for her adapted screenplay. Along with Noah Baumbach, certainly as well, and Margot Robbie nominated with other producers as well too, but they are both nominated. And it kind of is this interesting thing where, we talk about often with men, when men don't get, things that, positions of power or awards, we've seen as taking it away from them. Like talk about Brett Kavanaugh being the sort of like example of this, about him like being like, you're denying me this nomination to the Supreme Court, and him getting all upset about that when it's like, you're not owed the nomination to the Supreme Court. But the very fact that we would even consider it, which didn't even happen, but the fact that we even consider it, it's like seen as taking away something from him that he was rightfully owed, when you're not owed something like that. And I think the same thing is happening here with Greta Gerwig and Margot Robbie. It's like these two are women of certain privilege. Who again, I love Margot Robbie, like Harley Quinn, my gal. But like they are women of certain privilege. And so this fact that they didn't get this nomination is seen as like something taken away from them that they were owed, when they have these multi-million-dollar careers. They're going to make new work, and they are still getting nominated for the film. But it also speaks to this more interesting place that they're within, because then that gets filtered through this like white feminist lens of like, oh, it's because they're women, which in part may be true, but I think it also doesn't really touch upon the fact that like how they were able to be more positioned to get that nomination than like the director of Past Lives, who is also a woman, who I think made a much more like Past Lives is a fantastic movie. I have not gone to watch it, but like she was much less likely to get that nomination. Or directors from other countries who can only like submit, like each country can only submit like one film to the Oscar, or different movies. Like another movie that I saw this year, Mutt, which was about a trans man in New York City, I thought was fantastic. You should go watch it on Netflix. But also did, to my awareness, did not get a nomination here, and how like that marginalized person's perspective is not viewed as it did not have as much of a chance as these two, who are seen as taking away from. And again, it goes back to this same idea of how our society just uses womanhood constantly, especially white womanhood specifically, as this lens to just constantly generate these binary conflict conversations, rather than talking about like the inherent systemic problems of the Oscars and Hollywood in general, and also our culture writ large. So the only conversations we end up having are like Greta and Margot versus the Academy and how they push down women, or Margot Robbie versus Ryan Gosling and Ryan Gosling getting the nomination, or Margot Robbie versus Lily Gladstone, the white woman versus the Indigenous woman. Like these are the conversations that we have of like these conversations across like axes of binaries, like men versus women, women versus the system, white women versus Indigenous women, and yet we don't have a larger conversation around like how to have more propellant conversations about like maybe Hollywood is fucked up. And maybe the Oscars are fucked up. And maybe this idea of putting things in competition with each other. Maybe this idea of like exploitation of women and women's stories and the devaluing of marginalized stories, including women, is ultimately the larger problem, rather than like, who gets nominated to become the ultimate Highlander of the Oscars, and what art actually means. Anyways, thank you for indulging me in this ramble. Hopefully that made sense. I did not get as far in this Lego creation as I kind of hoped. So this very much not Lego, not Lord of the Rings thing will have to be done another day. But let me know what you think. I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below about the Barbie nomination. And beyond all that, I hope you all live long and prosper.